Okay, today I want to ask some cosmological questions. How can we be asking cosmological questions if we're not doing some kind of physics? Well, cosmology, the logos of the cosmos, and specifically today I want to talk about some of the logic of the way that we think about the cosmos, or more specifically, the way that we think about existence. Um, and I think the way that's going to fit in for everyone who's going to see this is that you're going to see the method at work. I mean, what is the philosophical method here? It's basically conceptual analysis. That's neither anything magic or fancy. I think you do understand when I say conceptual analysis, pretty much exactly what I mean, but nor is it anything sort of phony or shallow. I think you'll also see that we can make some progress and get a little bit clearer on the way that we're thinking about a couple things by just looking at the words closely and looking at concepts closely. In fact, I want to think about concepts specifically today. So the title of this presentation today is Why Is There Something Rather Than Nothing? Although I'm not really going to answer that question. I'm going to talk about some other issues which come up when we ask that question. I'm going to just sort of cruise through, I think, really three basic points here about thinking about the existence of the universe, or rather, we're just thinking about existence itself. And this was inspired a few years ago. There was a bit of a kerfluffle, I call it, between some physicists and philosophers, because there was a popular physics book that claimed to show that, like in a blurb on the cover, it claimed to argue and show how something came from nothing. And a philosopher published a little op-ed in the New York Times pointing out that it's not true that anything ever came from nothing. And that got the higher status physicists all mad. And then, as I say, there was a bit of kerfluffle and the articles back and forth. Um, I'm not necessarily a partisan about any of that, but it did get me thinking about some of the things that were being talked about. And it's true that the first thing that I want to talk to you about today, let's just get started with it, is going to be about the impossibility of explaining how something came from nothing. So, um, so here we are. We're going to talk about why is there something rather than nothing, sort of. More specifically, we're going to talk about the modal status of existence. The modal status of existence. What does that mean? Is that fancy? No, that's not that fancy. It just means, uh, could it have been that nothing existed? It's like that. Modal. Like what are the range of possibilities here? That's looking at the modal possibilities. What are all the different ways that things could have been? And one of the things that I'm wondering about today is it could have been that there just was nothing. And so that's sort of what we want to think about. It's going to necessitate thinking about the concept of nothingness, which actually people are surprisingly bad at doing, and I think that's really interesting. But I'll see if I can get into it. Sometimes the magic happens, sometimes it doesn't. All right, why something never came from nothing? Because something never came from nothing. You notice here I've got the scare quotes. It says came from, so we're going to look at what anybody meant. People just speak very loosely. It was natural enough, but when you're talking about issues about cosmology or theology or theories of God or the theories of existence, it's no time to talk loosely. I mean, if you want to do it, which for fun, why are we doing this? As much for fun as for anything else. But you have to have some discipline to have some fun. So we're going to ask ourselves what people really mean by came from and what they mean by nothing. So let's take the first one first. Something came from nothing. So, because you think that something came from nothing, or somebody sort of supposes something came from nothing. And then they think, well, we have to explain how it is that something came from nothing. Well, first of all, what's physical science? And we talk about this in the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of psychology class quite a bit. I'm going to share this one with you guys too. Right, because you can't have a physical explanation, are closed. Remember how that works in philosophy of mind? I mean, you can't bring in sort of the content of the thoughts. If they believe that this and they desire that, if you have to translate that down into some sort of closed physical language, supposedly, allegedly. So that's one of the metaphysical problems we're looking at there about philosophy of mind. Now you see here, in general, this is just another reiteration of that naturalism, right? What is physical science? Why do scientists, after all, insist that they do have some kind of privileged epistemic position, which I agree that they do. I'm a pro-science person, as you know. Um, so why? Well, because they have a discipline. What is the discipline? They limit themselves to physical objects, physical properties, physical events, physical processes. Okay. And so when we say it's closed, meaning that it's only physical stuff. The car mechanic talks about the fuel pump and the air hose. They don't talk about the fuel pump and the air hose and the fuel pump goddess and the air hose demon, unless you're, Jennifer Aniston's car mechanic in Beverly Hills. I'm sure they have that, but you get the point. Um, so by definition, what is physical science? Physical science is saying you have two physical entities of some kind, forces, things, whatever. And there are physical rules or laws of interaction. What are the rules or the laws? Are they logically necessary? For the most part, they're highly confirmed by experience. So, and that's just the definition of physical science. And so nothing doesn't have any physical properties. Nothing isn't any kind of physical thing at all. So whatever else physical scientists are doing or physical explanation is doing, it's not ever appealing to nothing. It's got to be appealing to something by definition. Conceptual analysis. What does physical science mean? What do we mean by physical science? Okay. And so Stephen Hawkins says, I can show you how something came from nothing. It turns out he's talking about gravity. This guy who got in the big hissy fit with some other guy, Krauss, who wrote a very good book about Star Trek, by the way. I recommend the Physics of Star Trek by Lawrence Krauss. It's good. Says quantum fluctuations. And then he got all mad at the philosophers because they don't even know what quantum fluctuations are. I don't need to know what quantum fluctuations are, Lawrence. They're something. They're not nothing. Okay. And that's all I need to know, but I do know it. And that's always going to be the case. I mean, it's always going to be the case that in fact you have to appeal to something or the other, because that's just how physical explanation works. So there isn't going to be any physical explanation that involves nothing as a factor. All right. Now, that in itself isn't really any great cosmic problem. Is it some sort of atheistic thing, pointy-headed intellectual thing to say that something couldn't come from nothing? Is that contrary? Am I the skunk at the garden party? No, because there's no reason in the first place to think that anything ever came from nothing. That's not really that interesting of a question. Physicists don't think that. They seem to have a pretty much of a cyclical view of things, just like people have had since time immemorial, by the way. But in any event, there is no reason to think that anything ever came out of nothing. Now, you could have had a situation where there was just nothingness, and we're going to have to talk more about nothingness, and then all of a sudden there was something. But it wouldn't be because of some condition or factor about the nothingness, which is no different from the nothingness at any, why at that time? Well, there isn't any time if there's nothing. There's no time. There's no time and space if there's nothing. You can't think of it. That we're going to talk about that next. So it's a pseudo problem. I mean, there's no need to explain how something came out of nothing because there's no reason to think that something ever did come out of nothing. In the sense of coming out of it, in the sense that there's some causal relation, we know, like I just said, that it's not true that anything ever came out of nothing. It could have been that there was nothing, and then the next moment there was something, but it wouldn't have been anything about the nothing. Yeah. All right. But let's talk about this concept of nothing, the concept of nothing and the concept of concepts. Because conventionally, like if you look in linguistic books about concepts, you'll find these representational theories that there's sort of maybe there's a master avatar of a concept, and then there's literature about like, well, what about people's concept of birds? Or what about people from different parts of the world? Or is it more like you have sort of a checklist of things, when you get enough bird-like details, you get a bird hit? But in any event, these theories about how concepts work are representational. But the concept of nothing isn't a representational concept. We try really hard. Let me step out to talk about it, because this is kind of, I had an interesting experience with all of this, because I started to think about nothingness. And, you can't, I mean, um, you can't conceive of it. You can think of, like, you see a little galaxy in a black space, and then you, in your mind's eye, and then you make the little galaxy go poof, and you have blackness, and you think, okay, well, that's what I mean. I just mean there was something, and then poof, there was nothing. But there's still blackness. There's still a void. Void's not nothing. Void is something. It's important in Buddhism too, by the way. Void's not nothing. Um, but and zero is not nothing. Zero is a number, a symbol. It seems, well, okay, but we know it's a symbol for a concept, but it's not working the way that most symbols for concepts work. And it's not the null set. That's a set. It's not a possible world where nothing obtains, because that's a possible world. None of those things are nothing. And I had the most remarkable experiences talking to people about this. People would insist that maybe there was stuff about nothing that we didn't know. Maybe we'd discover something about nothing. I talked to a man who got a little miffed because he wanted to insist that nothing had a surface. He thought he knew that nothing had a surface. And we don't, there's nothing that we don't know about nothing. Okay. And when I say there's nothing we don't know about nothing, I'm necessarily and certainly correct. And if you don't see why both of those statements are necessarily correct, you're not grasping the concept. And again, it's a logical concept. Nothing isn't a something. It's an absence of something. And that's something very different. The language doesn't cooperate. The language wants to designate nouns. And the metaphysical grammar of the language, if you will, when you apply a noun to something, it makes it sound like it's a thing. And the one idea or thing to think about that doesn't work the most is the one of nothingness. It's really hard to think about. Okay, so let's get back to that. It's a purely logical concept. It can't be denoted. And as I said, that calls into question the way we think about concepts. I'm skeptical about representational theories of mind for various reasons, and I talk about that at length in other places. But here's one where it looks like nothingness is not. It looks like you can think about it, sort of, but it's not the type of thing that you can picture. It's not a form of representational thought, as I said, that last bullet point, a point I already made. Well, okay, but why go on about that? Well, that actually has an interesting then further logical implication about modal logic. And then don't panic. Let me just explain modal logic. Actually, it's kind of cool, and this is kind of a good thing to understand. What is modality in language? You have, again, this is the first bullet point in its entirety. This is modality. We say about some things that they are possible, about others that they are impossible. Some things we claim are necessary, others are contingent. We can say this about states of affairs, ways that things are in the world, or we can say it about the truth of propositions. And probable and improbable, which just is really going to talk, well, as it says, empiricists have traditionally had problems with probability. Hume wasn't sure that there was really any such thing as probability. Spinoza didn't think so. He's a rationalist, but because you say, well, there's a 40% chance that the next card is less than 10, but the fact is the next card just is what it is. So isn't it only your lack of knowledge that injects probability reasoning into the world? That's roughly, I think, what Spinoza thinks about it. And Hume's pretty skeptical that there's anything like possibility. He's not. Empiricists tend not to be impressed by the cause of freedom. But modality is a big problem for computers. Computers are very literal critters. A computer just has an X or not an X, or has two little beings in its universe, an X and a Y. But it's very literal. I mean, there's an X. The idea that the X has some modal property that it distinguishes it from the other X's is something that was difficult in logic to symbolize. So you have like propositional logic and then symbolic logic, and then beyond that you would do modal logic. But it's a really, as I say, it was a long, many years. And in the tradition, a lot of people just really didn't think there was really such a thing, maybe as probability in the world at all. The very the very literal computer can get to represent modal logic or model modal status by quantifying over sets of possible worlds. I know that sounds like a big one, but let's just look at the third bullet point there and you'll see what I mean. As I say, it's really not that mind-bendingly hard to understand. How do you do it? When you say that something's possible, you say, well, possible is saying it's true in some possible world. There's at least one possible world where it's true. To say it's impossible, to say it's false in all possible worlds. There's no possible world where that's true. To say it's necessary is to say that it's true in all possible worlds. And again, contingent, well, there's some possible world, at least one possible world where it's false. And probabilities are sort of bigger, smaller sets of possible worlds. It's more likely that there's a much larger set of possible worlds where Hillary Clinton's president of the United States than me, right? Okay. So why put it in terms of possible worlds? Well, for one thing, as I explained to you, a machine like a computer that only can execute very literal instructions then needs to be dealing only with concrete things. And possible worlds logic gives you concrete things, sets of possible worlds. The computer can think they're all the same because this is a possible world, right? Look around, this is one. But the concept of nothing, I mean, this is the idea that I wanted to say, this is one of my sort of 3 points today. The concept of nothing can't be modeled by possible worlds modal logic, because the only way that possible worlds modal logic can talk about nothingness would be to say that there was a possible world where nothing obtained. But that's, as they say, a possible world, right? And nothingness is the absence of possible worlds altogether. So there's the edge of it. And so is there any utility loss there? Yeah, actually there is, because the real question, it seems to me, that is very under-examined in theological and cosmological discussions. It's about the modal status of existence. That is to say, is the fact that something exists rather than nothing a necessary fact or a contingent fact? The modal status of existence seems to me, now in theology we say, oh, well, we've got to know about where the world came from. That's why you sort of have sometimes this unthinking assumption that, well, we have to explain how something came from nothing, which we don't. Where existence came from, it looks to me like that appears to be sort of an incoherent question altogether, as I say, because it doesn't look to me like we've got the tools, the explanatory tools to deal with something appearing where there was nothing before. But the more interesting question, the second bullet point there, is the modal status. That is the fact that something exists rather than nothing. And so we've done some work on experience, on appreciating what nothingness really would be. Nothingness wouldn't just be that there was no matter and energy in the universe, and that the universe was a big empty void. Of course, depending on how you look at it, David Lewis points out what I think is a good point, is that a universe isn't like the bottle that holds the beer. The universe is just all the stuff that exists. That's what the universe is. It's not a vessel. It's just everything that exists, including space and time, by the way. Space-time, which is something that exists. So what's the modal status of that? If you say that it's contingent, what you're saying is that it might have been true that there could have been nothing. And again, notice that doesn't imply that there ever was nothing or ever will be nothing. It's not about nothingness. The point is about somethingness. The point is about what exists. The point is about the universe, not an abstract universe or a theoretical universe either, but this very universe in which we sit. That is. The question is this universe, the existence of this universe, contingent? Could it have been, is there any reason why not? That there might just have been nothing. Would have been a lot easier just to have nothing, you know? I mean, zero effort, right? Oh, zero matter and energy. It certainly seems to me that the default condition would be nothingness rather than anything existing. I mean, that is to say, if anything, I mean, if you had to guess, you'd guess that nothing existed, right? Except if you were Descartes, you'd figure that out. But in general, so let's take anything in the world, any just thing, my coffee mug. Is it necessary or contingent? Okay, for so quotidian physical objects, we tend to think that they are contingent. That goes up pretty high. We think planet Earth is contingent. I think Milky Way galaxy is contingent, because they might not have existed. So for physical things, you know, we tend to think, okay, well, surely for that individual thing, its existence is contingent. Now you think about the physical world in general, all physical existence, is it contingent? Now you can't just assume that since every part of it appears contingent, the whole is contingent. That would be fallacious reasoning. But nonetheless, it's hard to see. I mean, it looks to me, and this is an informal argument, it looks to me like the burden of proof really has to lie on the person who says that they think that it's necessary, that necessarily something exists. I see no reason whatsoever to think that necessarily something exists. And if it's persuasive that the existence of the universe is contingent, then it looks to me like it's got to be that God is contingent, right? Well, for one thing, I mean, if we want to be sticklers about it, if you want to claim that God exists, then you know that's existence. I'm talking about the existence of anything, including God. Is it contingent or necessary? If you say God is necessary, most people are going to say God is necessary. They're going to say it in the way they say God is omnipotent or God is omniscient. That is to say, they're going to stipulate that as a quality of this God, the concept that they have. But that's a different thing. You know, you'd say, well, why is God omnipotent? You know, well, why is God necessary? Why is it necessarily true? You know, and people like the rationalists or Plato will wave their arms around and say, well, but it has to be that it's logically necessary that this is the case. I don't know how, but it has to be. But there isn't any obvious reason why that's the case. And it certainly does look to me. I mean, I don't have to concede anything if I'm a naturalist and I want to be a naturalistic monist. I mean, it looks to me like it's a common sense argument that the default position is going to be contingent. That is, that the burden of proof is going to be on the person who says that there's some reason why anything, including God, exists necessarily. It may, you know, the reason that it's sort of an offensive idea to the believer is precisely because it's subversive, and that just doesn't mean that it's wrong. Now you could say something like, oh no, well that's a different argument. No, never mind. There are different arguments that relate to this. Okay, he snickers. So the modal status of existence. Again, what's the takeaway from here? It seems to be a red herring to say that something ever came from nothing. Corollary, physical science can't explain how anything came from nothing. Never could, never will. It's not about not having some information. It's not an empirical problem. It's a logical problem. Then next takeaway, well, it looks like we can't really model nothingness logically very well at all. It looks like when we do logic, we're just sort of assuming that there's a world of some sort or another, including, of course, obviously we do possible worlds, modal logic. It doesn't look like we can even represent the contingency of existence because we can't represent the lack of existence. But you know, what does that do? Does that mean you can't talk about it or somehow it's wrong or it's inconceivable? No, not at all. It looks to me, again, I'll just say this and then I'll be done and I'll let you go. I'm going to put up this and another one. for the 2 philosophy seminars, and then we'll be done. It just looks to me as if until someone comes up with some reason why I should think otherwise, it looks to me intuitively very clear that I should think that existence is contingent, that it just could have been that there was nothing. Okay, it's just, and again, that's a fact about, if it is a fact, it's a fact about the world that exists. It's not about anything else. It's about where we are, this world, that it is contingent, that it has that modal property. That doesn't mean that there was ever a time it didn't exist or there'll ever be a time when it doesn't exist. Only that it has the modal property of being contingent. It didn't have to exist. It's not necessary. Okay, that's the point. Okay, alrighty.